Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet type. At 32, she lived alone in a modest apartment on Maple Street, working as a librarian at the local branch. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who kept to herself, always polite but never one for long conversations. She had a routine that rarely changed. Morning coffee at 7, work by 8:30, home by 6, and lights out by 10. The garbage truck came every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 9:15 in the morning. Sarah had memorized the schedule, not because she cared about trash day, but because the rumbling engine always interrupted her quiet breakfast time. She would peek through her kitchen window, watching the two-man crew efficiently handle their route. There was something almost mechanical about their movements. Grab the bin, dump it into the truck, move to the next house. But there was one garbage collector who caught her attention differently. Miguel Santos, though she didn't know his name, yet had been working this route for 3 years. He was probably in his mid-40s with graying temples and weathered hands that spoke of hard work. What made him different wasn't his appearance, but his gentle way with the neighborhood dogs who would bark at the truck, and how he always made sure to properly close the gate at the house with the elderly woman who forgot to latch it. Sarah noticed these small kindnesses from her window perch. She saw how Miguel would pause to pet Mrs. Henderson's golden retriever, how he would straighten trash cans that had blown over in the wind, and how he never seemed frustrated even when people left their garbage scattered or improperly bagged. In a world where people rushed past each other without acknowledgement, Miguel moved through his work with a quiet dignity that intrigued her. The first time their eyes met was purely accidental. Sarah had been running late one Tuesday morning and was rushing to her car when the garbage truck pulled up. Miguel was stepping down from the passenger side, and their gazes crossed for just a moment. He nodded politely, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sarah felt her cheeks warm as she quickly looked away and hurried to her vehicle. That brief encounter stayed with her throughout the day. She found herself thinking about it during her lunch break, wondering why such a simple moment had affected her so strongly. Sarah had always been practical about relationships. She'd had a few boyfriends over the years, but nothing that sparked any real passion or excitement. Her last relationship had ended 2 years ago when David, an accountant she'd met through friends, decided she was too reserved for his taste. The next Friday, Sarah found herself positioning her morning routine so she'd be near the window when the truck arrived. She told herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. When Miguel appeared, she watched as he worked with the same steady efficiency she'd observed before. This time, however, she noticed something else. He seemed tired, perhaps sad. His usual gentle interactions with the neighborhood pets were there, but something in his posture suggested he was carrying a weight she couldn't understand. Over the following weeks, Sarah's awareness of Miguel grew from casual observation to genuine interest. She learned his schedule, noticed that he always wore a faded baseball cap, and saw how he would sometimes pause to stretch his back between houses. She also noticed that he never seemed to have anyone waiting for him at the end of his shift. No family members picking him up, no friends stopping by to chat. The turning point came on a particularly cold Tuesday morning in November. Sarah was running behind schedule again, but this time it wasn't because she was late for work. She had been standing at her window longer than usual, coffee mug in hand, watching Miguel work his way down the street. There was something different about his movements that day, slower, more deliberate, as if each step required extra effort. When the truck reached her building, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of retreating from the window as she usually did, she opened it slightly and called out, "Good morning." The words were simple, but they represented a break from her established pattern of observation without interaction. Miguel looked up, surprised but not displeased. He raised his hand in a brief wave and replied, "Morning, miss. Hope you have a good day." His voice was warm despite the early hour and cold weather. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. That evening, Sarah found herself thinking about their brief exchange more than she cared to admit. She wondered about Miguel's life beyond his work uniform and scheduled route. Did he have family? What did he do during his time off? Was he happy, or was the sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his posture a constant companion? These questions, felt presumptuous even to herself, but she couldn't shake them. The next Friday brought an unexpected development that would change everything between them. Sarah was preparing for work when she heard shouting from the street below. Looking out her window, she saw Miguel standing beside the garbage truck, but he wasn't moving with his usual steady pace. Instead, he appeared to be arguing with his co-worker, a younger man Sarah had barely noticed before. Their voices carried up to her window, though she couldn't make out the words. Miguel's body language spoke of frustration and disappointment, while his co-worker seemed agitated and defensive. The argument between Miguel and his co-worker escalated quickly. Sarah watched from her window as the younger man, whose name tag read Danny, became increasingly aggressive. His face was flushed red, and he was pointing accusingly at Miguel, while shouting something about covering and money. Miguel maintained his composure, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands clenched at his sides. Danny suddenly shoved Miguel backward against the side of the garbage truck. The older man stumbled but didn't retaliate. Instead, he straightened his uniform shirt and said something in a calm voice that only seemed to infuriate Danny further. Sarah gripped her coffee mug tighter, feeling an unexpected surge of protective anger toward Miguel, a man she barely knew but had grown to respect through her quiet observations. Without warning, Danny grabbed something from the truck's cab. It looked like a metal tool of some kind, and raised it threateningly toward Miguel. Sarah's heart began racing. This was no longer just a workplace disagreement, it was becoming dangerous. She watched Miguel raise his hands peacefully, trying to de-escalate the situation, but Danny's rage seemed beyond reason. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could call the police, but by the time they arrived, something terrible might have already happened. She could shout from the window, but she was 3 floors up and wasn't sure her voice would carry effectively. The only other option seemed impossible for someone of her reserved nature: go down there herself and intervene. The decision was made for her when Danny took a step closer to Miguel with the tool still raised. Sarah abandoned her coffee mug on the windowsill and ran for her apartment door. She didn't pause to grab a jacket or consider the consequences. All she could think about was that Miguel, this kind man who took time to pet neighborhood dogs and help elderly residents, was in danger. Racing down 3 flights of stairs in her work heels proved challenging, but adrenaline carried her forward. She burst through the building's front door and onto the sidewalk, just as Danny was shouting something about Miguel being too old for this job and needing to stay out of his business. Up close, Sarah could see that Danny appeared to be under the influence of something. His pupils were dilated, and his movements had an erratic quality. "Stop!" Sarah called out, her voice stronger than she expected it to be. Both men turned to look at her in surprise. Miguel's expression showed concern for her safety, while Danny's face twisted with annoyance at the interruption. Sarah realized she had no plan beyond getting their attention, but she pressed forward anyway. "Whatever this is about, fighting won't solve it," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. She positioned herself slightly between the 2 men, though she was careful not to get too close to Danny with his makeshift weapon. "Miguel, are you okay?" Danny laughed harshly. "Miguel, you 2 know each other?" He looked between them with suspicious eyes. "What's this? Some kind of setup? You calling the cops on me, lady?" "Nobody's calling anyone," Sarah replied quickly, though she was already mentally calculating how fast she could reach her phone if needed. "I just saw the commotion from my window and wanted to make sure everyone was safe." Miguel stepped forward slightly, his attention focused on Sarah rather than Danny. "Miss, you shouldn't be out here. This isn't your problem to solve." His voice carried genuine worry for her well-being, which only strengthened Sarah's resolve to help him. "Maybe it's not my problem," Sarah said, "but I'm making it my business." She turned to Danny, who was still gripping the tool but had lowered it slightly. "What's this really about? Miguel seems like a decent person and you're both just trying to do your jobs." Danny's drug-fueled paranoia began to show more clearly. "Decent person? He's been reporting everything to the supervisor. Every little mistake, every time I'm 5 minutes late, every time I need to take a break. He's trying to get me fired." His voice rose to almost a shout. and several neighbors had begun peering out their windows at the disturbance. Miguel shook his head sadly. "Danny, that's not true. I never reported anything about you. The supervisor has his own eyes. He doesn't need me to tell him when someone doesn't show up for work or comes in impaired." "Liar." Danny raised the tool again, but this time Sarah was ready. She pulled out her phone and held it up visibly. "I'm calling 911 right now if you don't put that down," she said firmly. "This has gone far enough. You're threatening someone with a weapon over what sounds like workplace issues that have nothing to do with Miguel personally." The mention of police seemed to penetrate Danny's altered state somewhat. He looked around and seemed to notice for the first time that they had attracted attention from other residents. Mrs. Henderson from 2 houses down was standing on her porch with her phone already in hand, clearly ready to make the same call. Sarah was threatening. Danny's grip on the tool loosened, but his anger remained. "This isn't over," he muttered, dropping the metal object to the ground with a clatter. "You think you're protecting him, but you don't know what kind of person he really is." Without another word, Danny stormed away from the garbage truck, leaving Miguel and Sarah standing together on the sidewalk. The whole confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but Sarah felt as if she'd lived through an hour of drama. Her hands were shaking slightly as she put her phone away. Miguel bent down to pick up the tool Danny had dropped. It appeared to be a wrench from the truck's emergency kit. He examined it briefly before setting it on the truck's running board. "Thank you," he said quietly to Sarah. "You didn't have to get involved, but I'm grateful you did." "Are you hurt?" Sarah asked, studying his face for any signs of injury. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she was becoming acutely aware of how close she was standing to Miguel, and how little she actually knew about the situation she'd just inserted herself into. Miguel shook his head, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm not hurt, just shaken up. Danny's been having problems for months now. I think he's gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd, maybe drugs. Today was the worst I've seen him, though." He looked at Sarah with genuine gratitude. "I'm Miguel Santos, by the way. I should have introduced myself properly before now." "Sarah Martinez," she replied, finally feeling her heartbeat begin to return to normal. "I live in the apartment building here. I've seen you on your route many times." She paused, unsure how much to reveal about her window observations without sounding like she'd been stalking him. "The lady in 3B who always has the yellow curtains," Miguel said with a slight smile. "I've noticed you too. You're always very punctual with your trash, never any mess, makes the job easier." There was warmth in his voice that made Sarah feel less foolish about her confession. The sound of the garbage truck's engine reminded them both that Miguel was still on the job, even though his partner had abandoned him. Miguel looked at the truck with concern. "I should probably call this in to my supervisor. Danny left me with a full route to finish alone, and there's the incident to report." Sarah glanced at her watch and realized she was already running late for work. But something about Miguel's situation made her personal schedule seem less important. "Will you get in trouble for what happened even though it wasn't your fault?" "Probably not, but there will be questions. The company doesn't like drama, and they really don't like police reports." Miguel pulled out an old flip phone from his pocket. "I should call my boss before someone else does." "Wait," Sarah said impulsively. "What if I gave a statement as a witness? I saw the whole thing. Danny was clearly the aggressor, and you tried to avoid conflict the entire time." Miguel paused in dialing, looking surprised by her offer. "You would do that? You don't even know me, and getting involved in workplace disputes can be complicated." "I know enough," Sarah said firmly. "I know you're kind to animals and elderly neighbors. I know you work hard and take pride in doing your job well, and I know you didn't deserve to be threatened with a weapon over workplace gossip." The gratitude in Miguel's eyes was unmistakable. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you know." He finished dialing his supervisor's number and began explaining the situation in calm, professional terms. While Miguel handled his phone call, Sarah found herself studying him more closely than her distant window observations had allowed. His face showed the weathering of someone who worked outdoors in all conditions, but his eyes held a kindness that matched her impressions of his character. His work clothes were clean and well-maintained despite their obvious age, and everything about his demeanor spoke of dignity and self-respect. When Miguel finished his call, he looked troubled. "My supervisor wants to see both of us at the depot after I finish this route. He's not happy about the situation, especially since this isn't Danny's first incident. There might be police involvement whether we want it or not. Sarah checked her phone and realized she needed to call in late to work. As she dialed the library, she wondered what exactly she was getting herself into. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was understanding about the emergency, but reminded Sarah that the children's reading program started at 10, and she was the only one scheduled to run it. "I need to get to work," Sarah told Miguel after ending her call. "But I meant what I said about giving a statement. Here's my number." She wrote it on a piece of paper from her purse. "Call me when you know what time you need me to come to the depot." Miguel took the paper carefully, as if it were something precious. "I can't tell you how much this means to me, Sarah. Most people wouldn't want to get involved in something like this." "Maybe I'm not most people," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the boldness of the statement. As she walked away toward her car, she could feel Miguel watching her, and for the first time in years she felt like someone truly saw her as more than just a quiet librarian who kept to herself. The rest of Sarah's morning at work passed in a blur of distraction. During the children's reading program, she found herself thinking about Miguel finishing his route alone, wondering what kind of questions his supervisor would ask, and trying to remember every detail of the confrontation with Danny in case she needed to provide an accurate account. Her coworker Janet noticed her preoccupation during lunch. "You seem different today," Janet observed over their salads in the library break room. "More energetic somehow, but also worried. Everything okay at home?" Sarah hesitated before answering. Janet was the closest thing she had to a friend at work, but Sarah had always kept her personal life very private. "I witnessed an incident this morning, a workplace conflict that got aggressive. I may need to give a statement to help someone who was being threatened." "That sounds serious," Janet said, leaning forward with interest. "Are you okay? Were you in danger?" "I put myself in potential danger," Sarah admitted, "but I couldn't just stand by and watch someone get hurt." As she said the words, Sarah realized how unlike her usual cautious self she had behaved that morning. Janet looked genuinely surprised. "Wow, Sarah. I mean, good for you for helping, but that doesn't sound like something you would normally do. You usually avoid confrontation completely." Sarah couldn't argue with that assessment. She had always been the type to cross the street, rather than walk past a group of loud teenagers. The person who would endure poor service rather than complain to a manager. But something about Miguel's situation had bypassed her usual instinct for self-preservation. "Maybe I'm changing," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. "This is Miguel. Supervisor wants to meet at 3 p.m. if you can make it. Address is 1247 Industrial Boulevard. Thank you again for everything." Sarah showed the message to Janet, who raised her eyebrows. "Miguel? That's the person you helped?" "The old garbage collector who was being threatened," Sarah confirmed, realizing how strange the whole situation must sound to someone who knew her well. "And you're going to meet with his supervisor this afternoon?" Janet's tone suggested she found this development unexpected, even concerning. Sarah looked at the message again, feeling a flutter of nervousness mixed with determination. "Yes, I am. He needs someone to corroborate his account of what happened." "Just be careful," Janet warned. "You don't really know this person or what kind of situation you're walking into." Sarah left work early that afternoon with Mrs. Chen's permission, explaining that she needed to provide a witness statement for a workplace incident. The library director seemed impressed that Sarah had taken such an active role in helping someone, noting that it showed excellent community spirit. The waste management depot was located in an industrial area of town that Sarah had never visited before. As she parked her small sedan between two pickup trucks, she felt increasingly out of place in her librarian attire of neat slacks and a cardigan. The facility was utilitarian and somewhat intimidating, with large garage bays, heavy machinery, and the constant smell of diesel fuel and refuse. Miguel was waiting for her near the main office entrance, and Sarah felt a wave of relief at seeing his familiar face. He had cleaned up since their morning encounter, though he still wore his work uniform. "Thank you for coming," he said as she approached. I know this is an unusual situation. It's fine, Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The depot felt like entering a completely different world from her quiet library environment. Have you spoken with your supervisor yet? Briefly. His name is Tom Bradley, and he's been pretty fair to work with over the years. But this situation with Danny has him concerned about liability issues for the company. Miguel held the door open for her. He said there might be a police officer here too, just to get an official statement. The office interior was basic but clean, with industrial carpeting and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly harsh. Tom Bradley turned out to be a stocky man in his 50s, with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of someone who had worked his way up, from the trucks to management. He greeted Sarah with professional courtesy, but obvious curiosity about why a civilian was volunteering to get involved. Ms. Martinez, Miguel tells me you witnessed the incident with Danny Kowalski this morning. I appreciate you taking the time to come in. Bradley gestured toward a small conference room with a metal table and several chairs. Officer Williams from the city police is going to join us in a few minutes to get your statement. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness at the mention of police involvement, but Miguel caught her eye and nodded encouragingly. As they settled into the conference room, Bradley pulled out a folder thick with papers. Let me give you some background on what's been happening with Danny. Miguel probably didn't tell you the full story because he's too professional, but we've had multiple incidents. Over the next few minutes, Bradley outlined a pattern of problems with Danny that stretched back nearly 6 months. There had been complaints about his attitude from customers, missed shifts without proper notification, and suspicions about drug use. Miguel had not been reporting on Danny as Danny had accused, but other employees and supervisors had been documenting problems independently. Miguel actually tried to help Danny several times, Bradley continued. Covered some of his shifts when Danny called in sick, tried to talk to him about getting help for his problems, but Danny became paranoid and started seeing Miguel as the enemy instead of someone trying to help him. Sarah looked at Miguel with new understanding. So this morning wasn't really about workplace reporting at all? Danny's been using drugs more heavily lately, Miguel said quietly. Probably methamphetamines based on his behavior. When people get deep into that, they start seeing threats everywhere, even from people who care about them. Officer Williams arrived a few minutes later, a professional woman in her 30s who immediately put Sarah at ease with her calm demeanor. Ms. Martinez, I understand you witnessed an incident this morning involving threats with a weapon. Can you walk me through exactly what you saw? Sarah recounted the morning's events in detail, from her window observations to the final confrontation on the sidewalk. Officer Williams took careful notes and asked specific questions about Danny's behavior, the weapon he had threatened Miguel with, and the exact words that were exchanged. Based on your account and Mr. Santos's statement, we have enough for assault charges if the company wants to pursue them, Officer Williams told Bradley. Danny Kowalski has a history with us, mostly drug-related offenses and a few domestic disputes. This incident fits a pattern of escalating behavior. Bradley nodded grimly. We'll definitely be pressing charges. We can't have employees threatening each other with weapons, especially when there are witnesses and potential liability issues. He looked at Sarah. Your willingness to get involved probably prevented someone from getting seriously hurt today. After Officer Williams finished taking statements and left with copies of the relevant paperwork, Bradley turned his attention to Miguel's employment situation. I'm sorry about losing your partner on the route, Miguel. I know you and Danny had been working together for almost a year before his problems started. What happens now? Miguel asked. Will I be getting a new partner, or will the route be restructured? We're going to have to make some changes, Bradley admitted. Budget constraints mean I can't immediately assign you a new full-time partner. For now, you'll be working with temporary help from other crews, which means your schedule might be irregular for a few weeks. Sarah listened to this conversation with growing concern. It seemed unfair that Miguel would suffer consequences from Danny's behavior, especially since he had been trying to help his troubled co-worker. Will Miguel's job be secure? She asked, surprising both men with her direct question. Bradley looked at her with respect. Miguel is one of our most reliable employees. He's not losing his job, but the schedule uncertainty might make things difficult financially if he can't maintain his regular hours. Miguel nodded stoically, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. She suspected he lived paycheck to paycheck, like many working people, and irregular hours would create real hardship. Is there anything that can be done to minimize the impact on Miguel's schedule? She pressed. We'll do our best, Bradley said, though his tone suggested limited options. Miguel, why don't you take the rest of today off? Come in Monday morning, and we'll figure out the new arrangements. As they left the depot together, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction about helping Miguel and concern about the uncertainty he now faced. They walked toward their cars in comfortable silence until Miguel stopped beside her sedan. Sarah, I can't thank you enough for what you did today. Not just this morning, but coming here and giving your statement. Most people wouldn't have gotten involved. His voice carried deep sincerity. I'm glad I could help, Sarah replied, then hesitated before continuing. I'm worried about what your supervisor said about irregular hours. Will you be okay financially? Miguel's expression showed surprise at her concern. I'll manage. I always do. It might mean picking up some weekend work or odd jobs, but I've been through worse situations. Sarah found herself wanting to know more about those worse situations, about Miguel's life beyond their brief encounters. Would you like to get coffee sometime? She heard herself asking. I mean, to talk about normal things instead of workplace, crises and police statements. The smile that spread across Miguel's face was worth the risk of putting herself forward so boldly. I would like that very much, he said. Are you free tomorrow evening? Sarah spent Saturday morning second-guessing her impulsive coffee invitation. She changed clothes 3 times, settled on casual jeans and a sweater, then wondered if she should have suggested meeting somewhere more public than the small cafe near her apartment. By the time she arrived at Rosie's coffee house, she was 15 minutes early and thoroughly nervous. Miguel was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming mugs in front of him. He had traded his work uniform for clean jeans and a button-down shirt that brought out the warm brown of his eyes. He stood when he saw her approaching, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that Sarah found charming. I hope black coffee is okay, he said as she sat down. I wasn't sure how you liked it, and I wanted to have something ready when you arrived. Black is perfect, Sarah replied, touched by his thoughtfulness. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, using it as an anchor for her nervous energy. This is nice, I don't get out much for coffee dates. She paused, realizing how that sounded. I mean coffee meetings, social coffee. Miguel's gentle smile suggested he understood her nervousness. I don't either. It's been a long time since I've sat across from someone just to talk and get to know them better. They spent the first few minutes exchanging basic biographical information. Sarah learned that Miguel was 43, originally from Guatemala, and had been living in the United States for nearly 20 years. He had started working for the waste management company 5 years ago, after a construction injury ended his previous career as a roofer. The garbage route isn't glamorous, Miguel said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. But it's steady work with decent benefits. I like being outdoors, and there's something satisfying about keeping neighborhoods clean and organized. Sarah shared her own background, her work at the library, her literature degree from the State University, and her quiet life in the apartment on Maple Street. I've always been more comfortable with books than people, she admitted. Yesterday was probably the most spontaneous thing I've done in years. What made you do it? Miguel asked gently. You could have just called the police from your window. Why did you come downstairs and get directly involved? Sarah considered the question seriously. I've been watching you work for months, she confessed, feeling her cheeks warm. Not in a creepy way, just noticing things. You're kind to the neighborhood animals, you help Mrs. Henderson with her gate. You do your job with dignity even when people don't treat you with respect. When I saw Danny threatening you, I couldn't just stand by and watch someone hurt a good person. Miguel was quiet for a moment, processing her words. You've been watching me work for months? From my kitchen window, Sarah said, feeling foolish but committed to honesty. The truck comes by during my breakfast time, and I couldn't help noticing how you treated everyone and everything with care. I noticed you too, Miguel said softly. The woman in the yellow curtains who always had her trash properly sorted and never made a mess for us to clean up. I wondered what you did for work, whether you lived alone, if you were happy. He paused, meeting her eyes. I never imagined I'd get the chance to find out. The conversation flowed more easily after this mutual confession of curiosity. Sarah learned that Miguel lived in a small rental house across town, that he sent money to his elderly mother in Guatemala every month, and that he had never married because his focus had been on establishing himself in America and supporting his family back home. Miguel discovered that Sarah had been engaged once 5 years earlier to a fellow librarian who decided she was too quiet for a lifetime partnership. He learned about her love of mystery novels, her volunteer work reading to elderly residents at a local nursing home, and her dream of someday traveling to see the places she'd only read about in books. "What's your biggest regret?" Sarah asked, surprised by her own boldness in posing such a personal question. Miguel considered carefully before answering. "I regret not learning to speak English better when I was younger. My accent and grammar mistakes make some people think I'm not intelligent, even though I read extensively and stay informed about current events. It has limited some opportunities." Sarah felt a flash of anger on his behalf. "Your English is perfectly clear, and anyone who judges your intelligence based on an accent is missing out on knowing a thoughtful person." "Thank you for saying that," Miguel replied. "What about you? What's your biggest regret?" "Playing it safe all the time," Sarah answered without hesitation. "I've spent so much of my life avoiding risk and staying comfortable that I've missed out on experiences and connections with people. Yesterday was the first time in years that I acted on instinct instead of overthinking everything." They talked for nearly 2 hours, long enough for the cafe to fill with the dinner crowd and their coffee mugs to be refilled twice. Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in months, and Miguel's initial reserve gave way to animated storytelling about his most interesting encounters on his garbage route. There was this one house where the elderly gentleman always left perfectly organized recycling, but every week there would be one mysterious item mixed in with the bottles and cans. Miguel recounted. "Old shoes, kitchen utensils, even a small garden gnome once. It took me 3 months to figure out that his granddaughter was visiting and sneaking random objects into his recycling as a joke." Sarah was laughing when her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it briefly and her expression changed to concern. "It's from a number I don't recognize," she told Miguel. "It just says, 'You made a big mistake getting involved yesterday.'" Miguel's demeanor immediately became serious. "Can I see it?" Sarah showed him the message, watching as his jaw tightened with worry. "This is probably from Danny or one of his friends. I was afraid something like this might happen." "Should we call the police?" Sarah asked, feeling the anxiety from the previous day returning. "Let's see if there are any more messages first," Miguel suggested, though his protective instincts were clearly engaged. "Danny was paranoid and angry yesterday, but threatening you because you helped me would be escalating to a whole different level of stupid." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time the message was longer and more explicit. "Stay away from Miguel or you'll regret it. This is your only warning." Miguel's face darkened with anger. "Now we definitely call the police. This is harassment and intimidation of a witness. Officer Williams gave you her card yesterday, didn't she?" Sarah was already dialing the number, her hands shaking slightly as the reality of being personally threatened sank in. The carefree atmosphere of their coffee date had evaporated, replaced by a sobering reminder that her decision to help Miguel had created ongoing consequences she hadn't anticipated. Officer Williams answered on the second ring and listened carefully as Sarah read both text messages aloud. "I want you to save those messages and not respond to them," the officer instructed. "We'll trace the number and add this to Danny Kowalski's case file. In the meantime, I want you to be aware of your surroundings and call immediately if you see anyone suspicious around your home or workplace." As Sarah ended the call, Miguel reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. "I'm sorry this is happening because you helped me. I never wanted to put you in danger." "You didn't put me in danger," Sarah said firmly, though she couldn't deny feeling frightened. I made my own choice to get involved. I just didn't expect it to continue beyond yesterday." Miguel was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with guilt and concern. "Maybe we shouldn't see each other again until this situation with Danny is resolved. I don't want you to be a target because of me." "Absolutely not," Sarah replied with surprising vehemence. "I'm not going to let some drug-addicted bully dictate who I can and cannot spend time with. That would be letting him win." The threatening messages stopped after the first two, but the tension they created lingered for both Sarah and Miguel. Over the following week, Sarah found herself constantly checking her phone and looking over her shoulder when walking to her car after work. Miguel had started calling her every evening to make sure she was safe. Conversations that began with concern but often stretched into hours of deeper conversation about their hopes, fears, and growing feelings for each other. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after their coffee date, Sarah was preparing dinner when she heard sirens approaching her neighborhood. The sound grew louder until it seemed to stop directly outside her building. Curious and slightly concerned, she went to her kitchen window to investigate. 3 police cars were parked on Maple Street, their red and blue lights flashing in the early evening darkness. Officers were standing around what appeared to be Danny Kowalski, who was sitting on the curb with his hands cuffed behind his back. Sarah's heart began racing as she realized the confrontation she had feared might be happening was actually taking place right outside her home. Her phone rang immediately. It was Miguel, his voice tight with worry. "Sarah, are you okay? I just drove past your street and saw the police cars. Is Danny there?" "Yes. They have him in handcuffs outside my building," Sarah replied, watching through her window as Officer Williams appeared to be questioning Danny, while other officers searched a beat-up sedan parked nearby. "I think he might have been planning something." "I'm coming over," Miguel said without hesitation. "Don't go outside until the police give you the all-clear." Within 20 minutes, Miguel was at Sarah's door, having driven across town despite his concern about being seen together during the ongoing situation. Sarah let him in, grateful for his solid presence as they watched the police activity from her window together. Officer Williams knocked on Sarah's door an hour later, asking her to come downstairs to identify Danny and provide additional context about the threatening messages. Miguel accompanied her, and they learned that Danny had been arrested while attempting to break into the building's basement storage area, apparently planning to wait for Sarah to return home from work. He had drug paraphernalia, a knife, and a cell phone with draft messages to you that were much more explicit than the ones he actually sent, Officer Williams explained. "We think he was working up the courage to escalate his threats, possibly to physical confrontation. Your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, called us when she saw him trying to jimmy the basement door with a crowbar." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized how close she had come to a dangerous encounter. What happens now? Danny's looking at multiple charges: attempted breaking and entering, possession of illegal substances, possession of a weapon with intent to threaten, and harassment of a witness. With his prior record, he's probably going to serve significant jail time. Officer Williams looked between Sarah and Miguel. "You two can breathe easier. He won't be bothering either of you for a long while." As the police cars finally departed and the neighborhood returned to normal, Sarah and Miguel found themselves standing on the sidewalk where their first real conversation had taken place just over a week earlier. The crisis that had brought them together was finally resolved, leaving them to contemplate what came next. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if Mrs. Henderson hadn't seen him," Sarah said, unconsciously moving closer to Miguel's reassuring presence. "But she did see him and you're safe," Miguel replied gently. "Sometimes when bad things happen, they lead to good things we never expected." Sarah looked up at him, recognizing the deeper meaning in his words. "Are we talking about Danny's arrest or about us meeting each other?" "Both," Miguel said with a smile that made Sarah's heart skip. "A week ago, I was just the garbage man you watched from your window. Now I can't imagine not having you in my life." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Sarah felt the same way but had been afraid to voice it so soon after such an intense beginning to their relationship. I've been thinking the same thing, she confessed. I spent years living quietly and safely, never taking risks or putting myself in unexpected situations. Then I saw you in trouble and everything changed. Not just the situation with Danny, but how I see myself and what I want from life. Miguel reached for her hand and Sarah intertwined her fingers with his weathered ones. So, what do we want from life now? He asked softly. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the transformation she had undergone in just over a week. She had gone from being a woman who observed life from her window to someone who actively participated in protecting others and pursuing her own happiness. I want to keep being the person who runs toward trouble instead of away from it, she said. I want to travel to those places I've only read about in books. I want to learn Spanish so I can talk to your mother when you call her. I want to see what happens when two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances decide to build something together. Miguel's answer came in the form of a kiss, gentle and full of promise, right there on Maple Street, under the streetlights. When they broke apart, both were smiling. My supervisor called today, Miguel said. They found me a new permanent partner, and my schedule is going back to normal starting Monday. Regular hours, steady pay, and no more Danny to worry about. That's wonderful news, Sarah replied, genuinely happy for his stability but also curious about how it might affect their developing relationship. It also means I'll still be coming down your street every Tuesday and Friday at 9:15, Miguel continued with a grin. But maybe now instead of watching from your window you could come outside and say hello properly. Sarah laughed, remembering how their entire story had begun with her quiet observations from her kitchen window. I think I can manage that, though I might miss the mystery of wondering what you were thinking about during your route. You don't have to wonder anymore, Miguel said, squeezing her hand. You can just ask me over dinner or during our weekend trips to places you've only read about, or while we're teaching each other our languages. As they walked back toward her building together, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. She had run toward danger to help a man she barely knew, and in doing so, had discovered not just courage she didn't know she possessed, but also love she had never expected to find. The quiet librarian who kept to herself had been transformed into a woman willing to fight for what she believed in and pursue what made her happy. The garbage truck would still come down Maple Street twice a week, but now instead of being a distant rumble that interrupted her solitary breakfast, it would signal the arrival of someone who had changed her life completely. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary moments, and sometimes running toward trouble leads directly to finding home.